Hello, everyone. This is Tom Still from the Tech Council, and welcome to our Zoom event for today, Crossing the Coronavirus Chasm, which is going to include some tips for some investors whose names you know if you don't know them personally. And first of all, I hope everyone is well and weathering this as best they can. Here at the Tech Council, we've been doing a lot of things to try to stay in touch with the community here in Wisconsin and in some cases beyond. We've been working on a variety of things with our good partners such as WDC, with members of the congressional delegation, and just getting out a lot of information. I think by virtue of the fact that you're on today, you're probably getting our Tech Council Current newsletter, which has been pretty much a Monday through Friday publication right now. So it's great to be a part of things, and we're going to have other events to come, and you'll hear about those as we move along. But right now, I want to introduce our sponsor for today, and in fact, she and her colleagues at the Old National Bank have been a part of these programs back when we were live, which somehow seems like an eternity ago. Ileana Cherneva. Ileana, welcome, and tell us a little bit about the kinds of things the bank's doing at this point.
Thank you. Good morning. As Tom said, my name is Ileana Cherneva, and I am with Old National Bank, and I'm leading private banking in Wisconsin. And we know how important it is to be a source of strength and stability, and we embrace that responsibility as a financial institution. And for 186 years, Old National has stood with our clients and communities through natural disasters, economic distress, and other unexpected events. And during this period of disruption, we also recognize that some are facing unanticipated financial hardship. So Congress, as you know, passed the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, which included the Paycheck Protection Program, known as PPP for small businesses. I will reference to it as PPP going forward. The PPP will provide short-term cash flow assistance to small businesses to help these businesses and their employees deal with the immediate economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Loans are made by lenders certified by the Small Business Administration, SBA, and guaranteed by the federal government. And we are aware that many online sources are claiming that PPP application details have been finalized by the federal government. Some also claimed financial institutions are ready to begin partnering with clients now to get the application process underway. While we continue to receive information about the PPP application, I want to clarify that it's not yet final and ready. We are hopeful that details will be finalized in a matter of days, but we recommend applicants to start gathering the following information like 2019 tax returns if they've done it, 2019 year-end balance sheet and profit loss statements, last 4 quarters of payroll forms, verification of the number of the employees, Form 1099 miscellaneous for self-employed individuals. Also, I want to bring to your attention the coronavirus scam. Criminals are leveraging the coronavirus pandemic as an opportunity to commit fraud. So do not open attachments from unexpected source or communications. Be overly suspicious with any unsolicited information, and please do not fund missions that you're not sure that they're for real. And don't reply to any social media or text that the criminals are continuing to wrap up their fraud efforts. And I, as always, mention our values and actions. And today I want to finish my message like what we do as teams. All across our footprints, our members are helping the communities. Like in Minnesota, we support the 360 communities, and while we sponsor their fall gala and we asked them what they need further, and they indicated that they need grocery bags to reorganize and pay back the food bundles. So we donated 350 Old National yellow bags. We have a members in Madison who is still doing Meals on Wheels on Wednesday, and she continues doing her routes. We have members in Evansville that they are really good at making masks for the frontline people. So we are all in this together, and thank you for the time to share about Old National and our values.
All right. Well, thank you, Ileana, and great advice as always. Well, let's turn to introductions of our speakers here. And Angela, if you can advance that. So, two investors who are really well known in Wisconsin and well beyond will join us today. Tim Keane, who joins us from Arizona. He's director of Golden Angels. He has a long background both in that emerging company world and of course as an investor. He led the entrepreneurship programs and taught classes at Marquette for a long time, and he was the first recipient of our Excellence in Entrepreneurship Award, also known as Triple E, and that's because of his great contributions over time in just education and training for entrepreneurs and all the kind of linkages. So we'll hear from Tim in a few minutes about his perspectives and those of Golden Angels. Also next, John Neis. John's managing director of Venture Investors, which has offices in Madison and Ann Arbor. They really do focus on what's coming out of research universities and such as the UW-Madison and of course the University of Michigan. John leads their healthcare practice. He's on the board of directors for a number of their portfolio companies. He's one of the drivers behind the Wisconsin Venture Capital Association, and of course he's a board member for the Tech Council. And he's been twice on the Midas list for Forbes, and he's a member of our Investor Hall of Fame, which was established by the Tech Council. So what we hope to do today is hear from both, and then we'll take your questions over that chat function. But so I'm going to go now to Tim, and Tim, if you can take it away with a few of your observations about what young companies should be thinking about and doing right now.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. So first of all, in the interest of full disclosure, I'm an investor in John's funds, and so I defer to his expertise on almost all topics. And we're going to let him do most of this, and I'll be glad to answer questions at the end. But, I would say three things on this one slide. We're trying to over-communicate. We've been out asking people, what do you need? What can we do to be helpful? And in fact, in a couple of cases, we're topping up rounds and making other changes to help companies do well. In our current portfolio, we haven't pulled back any in-process funding, and I don't expect that we will. Our ed tech and healthcare IT sectors are very strong right now, and I think getting facts on both sides wherever it's possible is really helpful and helps people understand kind of where you're going to go. On new deals, I will tell you that the first question we're asking is how does the current set of issues affect the venture's business model? And because we're now doing everything this way, it probably is going to take us a little longer to get to know people, but we're making introductions as fast as we can to as many people as we can and helping companies have conversations rapidly so that if we can't be helpful, we're trying to find ways that they can be. And so that's my current comments. And of course, John's going to talk about the CARES Act, which is critically important to everybody. And he'll tell you how he thinks that's going to apply to all of your companies. So that's what I've got. I'll be here at the end for quick Q&A.
Yeah, and Tim, let me just get in here for a second. I mean, your overall message there is of course over communicating, but it's not like you're going away. You're doing what you can to help through Golden Angels, through other groups, and you're in touch with people all the time. So it's from it's moving ahead.
You know, there's this thing out on the internet floating around now, or somebody sent me this thing that said, name the song that was on the #1 hit list when you were 12 years old. I put down the Moonlight Sonata by Mozart. And, you know, the reality is that we've been around this so long and have seen this so many times that the world's not going to end, and we understand what companies need. And I don't think that, at least as a group, we would say, well, we're just not going to do anything. So, yeah.
Yeah, very good, very good. I noticed through things that I'm seeing through, for example, the National Venture Capital Association, that there are still deals happening. So let me now turn to John Neis, and a couple of things here. He's going to talk about the same kind of general advice, but also dive a little more into the CARES Act and some of the things that may mean for emerging companies. Welcome, John. It looks like a really nice art piece behind you.
That is a painting by T.L. Celine, who is a painting professor at UW-Madison. So I'd like to support those local artists who are all entrepreneurs by nature.
Indeed.
Well, great, thanks. So I'm going to cover a bunch of things. Not surprisingly, all of our portfolio companies have been meeting and talking about this to make sure we're all on the same page and to think about what risks we're exposed to and what things we change. And I think there's a couple key things to focus on. First and foremost, be safe, but also remain productive. I think an important message for employees, first and foremost, be safe, take care of yourself, take care of your family, monitor all the advice from healthcare professionals and government and others, and do the right thing. If you need to self-quarantine, do it. Let people know. We need to communicate. But at the same time, I think it's really important that everybody remain focused and try to proceed with daily business. With so many people working from home, and not everybody can working from home, but different kind of spacing for those who can't work at home, it is changing how we're functioning. And there are a million distractions now. I mean, if you're working at home, it can be just, others around the household, dogs, kids, you name it. And then there's all the news that's flowing. So we encourage people to keep in touch with each other, stick with their meeting schedules, communicate frequently. I think many of you have experienced that video conferencing has been really a powerful tool in this stretch. It keeps that human connection that we all crave. There's something really reassuring seeing your colleagues, seeing your business partners at a time when we're all feeling like we're in a bunker for a period of time here. But employees need to stay focused on their project and tasks. I think this time can be leveraged. There are things we can't do, and it frees us up to do those things we never have the chance to get around to. So, finally, if people have concern, they should be encouraged to kind of let their supervisors know early on, communicate so adjustments can be made within the organization.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't you come to the next slide, please? I think the first step is really, trying to assess what the risks are, what new risks you're facing because of this crisis, and kind of rank them, prioritize those that might be disruptive, those that you may be able to control, and develop mitigation plans. Even if they're not a problem today, it could become a problem, and start thinking about how you would mitigate it so you're out ahead of it rather than trying to react to it. A lot of companies have been impacted in their marketing and sales effort. I've got a portfolio company. They get all their lead generation from conferences around the country, and all those conferences are canceled.
Mm-hmm.
There's also a lot of people who are having problems with customer access, especially in healthcare systems. Just being able to make the old sales call and normal conversations, those doors are kind of shut. Travel is obviously a problem. Many have limitations on their activity. There's certain activities that have been shut down within organizations to be able to focus on this crisis. And then I think, also think about, is there any perceived product risk? I mean, if you have products that are used by multiple parties, is there any kind of concern of transmission of disease through, shared handling of things? So how does that impact your marketing and sales? I think you also need to be aware of market changes. Clearly, we have changing customer priorities in these times. Many are facing resource constraints, and there's a lot of decisions that are going to be deferred in this period of uncertainty when organizations don't know whether the resources they expected to have at the beginning of the year will continue to be there throughout the year. Supply chain can be a big issue. We had a number of companies that did source some components from China when the first wave of this hit, and suddenly they couldn't get parts. There's material shortages because of materials being diverted to some of the immediate needs for the crisis here. And I think you need to especially focus on those things that are long lead time, single source items in your supply chain, and consider the possibility that there may be a disruption because of the disease, the place where they operate becoming a hot spot. I think we also need to be prepared for workforce disruption, loss of key people, hopefully temporarily, but there's already been some notable high-profile deaths. The CFO of Jefferies, the investment bank in New York, passed away the other day. Sadly, it is real and very disruptive. It's also adding distractions for a lot of people. So, again, really focus on productivity. And there can be fear in the workplace. I think we all owe a huge debt of gratitude to everybody in the healthcare world right now for how they are stepping up and dealing with this. I saw one of Andrew Cuomo's press conferences the other morning, and he had a quote up from Franklin Roosevelt, and I think it said, courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the recognition that what you're doing is so important that you need to override your fear. And I think, many of you are doing really important things, and I think you need to talk about that. And for those of us who can work and can keep the economy moving, we really have a duty to do that, to try to not have this become a huge pause button for everybody, but try to keep some economic forces going forward. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the other major risk is access to capital, and that's a longer discussion. And we can start out with a conversation about that, if you give me the next slide. So I think you do need to be prepared for a period of capital scarcity. We have not stopped making investments, nor have many others out there, but there is a lot more caution and care in looking at investments because if history is a guide, there can be some challenges going forward. So, my first message to companies is if you have an opportunity to take some capital, do it. Top off rounds if you have the chance to do it. If you get, if you were targeting a certain dollar amount and you have a chance to close on more, by all means take it. We've had a number of companies who have been securing follow-on commitments from their investors early, pushing out their runway to a different date and different set of milestones to try to get to a different place given the disruption of the crisis. Certainly look at available debt if it's available to you, pursue grants that are out there, but you really need to extend time to the next funding if it's at all possible for you to do. If companies can get to a point where they have 2 years of cash on their balance sheet, I think this is an important time to strive for that goal. Not everybody's got that luxury, but this is not the time to get in a tough valuation discussion and take less capital because you don't like the price. It's the time to protect yourself from further dilution over the course of the next year if capital proves to be very scarce. I think you need to reassess your budget. Look at the efficiency of the spending you had planned. We had one portfolio company that was about to do its commercial launch. They had two focuses this year, building their product menu, and they were doing a major commercial launch. They had identified 6 salespeople that they were about to add, top-notch people, and then the bottom dropped out. And in this case, they are getting a disruption in their leads, and they're not able to make sales calls on their customers. So they decided that money was better reserved, and a delayed launch was going to be more efficient. So they deferred that spending. It is a time to think about tightening your focus. If you've got multiple projects going, does it make sense to move one of them to the back burner to allow yourself to move the other projects further down the path and buy more time? I wouldn't say make all decisions instantly. I think you need sometimes deferral till there's more clarity. I mean, I've had countless people, early in meetings say, well, welcome to the new normal. And I keep saying, this is not the new normal. We are on the journey to the new normal. We're figuring it out right now. And I think there are, maintain your strategic focus. Don't lose that. Do the things that continue to be important. History does show that the best time to take market share are when markets are down. It's the cheapest time because, everybody's resource constrained. So if in fact you're in a position to grow, to do things, keep your strategic focus and do that. So, but think hard about new spending initiatives and whether now is really the right time, and think about tightening your focus and deferring some initiatives you already have underway. We are likely to have a period of capital scarcity. If we look back at the 2001 and 2008 experiences, there was a period of time where commitments to the industry, venture capital industry, shrank dramatically following an event. And it really comes about because of what I would call the institutional dilemma. Most institutions are allocating a percentage of their asset classes, a percentage of their assets to the asset class. So, if it's $1 billion institution and they've got 5% allocated, they're doing $50 million to the asset class. Well, when all the public stocks come down, the denominator shrinks. And so suddenly that percentage is higher. They've also, to hit that target, they've overcommitted. So if they actually want to have, 50 million invested, they might have to have 100 million in commitments out there, because not all the capital is drawn down, and then as things are exited, capital is returned. Well, when this happens, the exits often come to a stop. Things aren't going public. There's a drop in acquisition activity. So money isn't flowing back to the institutional investors, and the capital calls can accelerate. So suddenly all those commitments get drawn down. So that $1 billion pool is suddenly an $800 million pool, and all the commitments get drawn down. Well, instead of being 5%, suddenly they're at 12.5%. So then to get back to their target allocation, they slow commitments to new funds until they get back to the target. So that is likely to result in fewer and smaller funds formed for the next few years. Doesn't mean the activity is going to stop, but there is going to be less capital available, most likely, for a period of time. And investors are likely to be more selective. And many of the funds that were formed over the last several years may disproportionately be focusing on maintaining reserves for their existing investment, because they know there's not going to be as many new investors to come into syndicates in future rounds. So those are the challenges for the capital markets right now. Give me the next slide. We could talk about the CARES Act. I dropped the security part. I should say CARES, not CARE. Let me walk through this. I'm sure many of you have seen the basics of this legislation, which I think can be very helpful for many businesses. But let me just go over the rundown and then the complications. First of all, eligibility. This is really targeting small business concerns. Generally, that's under 500 employees, although there's certain NICS codes where it is defined with a larger number. For example, biotechnology is under 1,000 employees. The company has to be in existence prior to February 15th of this year, so it's really targeting companies that were already operating when this crisis hit. You have to be impacted by COVID-19, but it's a pretty broad definition of what is an impact. That can be supply chain disruption, staffing issues, loss of sales, customers, closure, lots of stuff. And I think, there are actually very few companies that have been immune to some form of impact here. You do need to make a good faith certification that the funds are necessary and will be used for eligible expenses. And I'll talk about what's eligible in a minute. And, the government's going to presume that, those certifications are in good faith. Next slide, please. So the amounts that are available, the maximum is $10 million, but the formula is basically taking your average monthly payroll costs over the previous year and multiplying that times 2.5 up to the maximum of 10 million. Now, so if you have an average payroll cost monthly of $100,000, the maximum loan would be $250,000. So this is not like a new source of financing. It's essentially a mechanism to allow you to hit a pause button and keep your employees on payroll and keep things moving and account for some of the lost time here. So the definition of payroll costs in calculating that, it's a salary up to $100,000. It does include healthcare expenses, taxes, and everything. So it's really grossed up. We're pretty sure that they mean that if you have a highly someone making 150,000, it's their first 100,000 that can count towards this, but this may have to be clarified in the regulations. Next slide, please. This is a loan that can turn into a grant. So you have to use it for eligible expenses. But there is a formula. Basically, if you keep your people on payroll and you are keeping their pay level at the same level, there is a mechanism for this to be forgiven over time, which is, makes this particularly attractive if in fact you're eligible. So you can, work with your advisors to determine, the likelihood of loan forgiveness. But again, I think the key is if you keep people on it at their full salaries, you should be good. Next slide, please. So the allowable uses for the funds: payroll costs and healthcare costs, mortgage, rent, utilities, interest payments. So, pretty much most of your major monthly expenses, which is good. The loans will come through banks and other financial institutions that give SBA and loans. So like our sponsor today. It is federally guaranteed for the lender. Fortunately, there's no personal guarantees required. That was a big battle during the passage of the legislation, and fortunately, wisdom prevailed, not asking officers and directors to provide personal guarantees or collateral on these loans. And you can see the rest of the terms. Overall, it's a really reasonable approach. Next slide. However, it's not without its complications, and you have probably heard a lot about affiliation rules and how this complicates it for many companies. And I hope you can, I would love to be able to allow you to walk away from this presentation with absolute clarity on this matter, but unfortunately, it is somewhat clear as mud right now. But let me just describe the core problem. So you have to be under 500 employees, that much is clear. But when it counts the employees, it's accounting the affiliates as defined by SBA rules. So a venture fund and some or all of its portfolio companies, and I think this would also be true if you had a corporate investor, may be an affiliate. Certainly that, I think everybody would understand if the venture fund or a corporate investor owned more than 50%, that it would be deemed to be in control. But it also holds true in many cases with minority investments. So, the complication is all around control rights that may be in a typical venture capital agreement, and whether that constitutes control of the company by a minority investor. Now, this is a battle that is continuing. There was a letter put together by a large coalition led by the National Venture Capital Association and others, and they got lots of organizations to sign on, arguing to Secretary Mnuchin to have an interpretation here that makes sense. Some of the rules here, if you feel like you're not understanding them because they don't seem to make sense, you're not misunderstanding them. They just don't make sense.
Right.
So we are fighting this on an ongoing basis. Tom has been very involved with the tech councils in North America, and they signed on to this as well, right, Tom?
Right. Yeah, the Tech Councils in North America is a group of other groups that look a lot like us, both across the United States, and signed on early on, and we're in touch with members of the Wisconsin delegation. And the same thing is going on with tech councils in other states with their delegations. In fact, I've already seen some signs this morning in the news that there may be some movement afoot in Congress.
Yes. Well, give me the next slide here. So, you know, couple things here. First of all, again, here's the problems with affiliation. What constitutes control? I'm not going to go through this whole list, but it is really a lot of the stuff that is typical in a standard venture capital agreement that could constitute control. And again, the big concern is around minority investors. So if you give me the next slide. So this is where the negotiations were as of yesterday. First of all, I'm pleased to see that we have had a number of members of Congress on both sides of the aisle write letters to Secretary Mnuchin, supporting the position of the NVCA and all these others to provide clarity on this. So a couple caveats about what I'm going to say here. There is progress in these conversations, but nothing I'm going to say is ironclad. Nothing has been finalized. So just view this as hopeful. The ideal route is clean and clear guidance. The challenge with a lot of this is it's left to interpretation by the lenders, the banks who are providing these loans, and you will get a wide range of interpretation, and some will take an abundance of caution on these to take very strict interpretations, which really can rule out a lot of companies that really should be eligible. Couple interpretations from the SBA seem to be emerging that will help many qualify. First of all, the percentage ownership test. There's been many cases in the past where a single minority investor, just because of some of the, being above some percentage, somewhere between 20 and 50, is still deemed to be controlling. It looks like those minority ownership percentages will be turned off based as a basis for just determining control, and it'll really go back to just control rights. A second very promising thing is it looks like the sort of negative control rights will be determined individually by investor as opposed to a class. Historically, one of the problems with minority investors is, each individually may not be able to block or veto an action, but collectively as a class of investors, say a group of Series A or a Series B investors may have these kind of veto rights. And there were determinations that they collectively had control. It looks like it's going to be determined individually. If any individual investor has these, they may be determined to have an affiliate. And common investments are not going to be taken into consideration. So that's encouraging as well. So there's progress here. It's not clear. I guess I would encourage everybody who cares about this, if this impacts you, to communicate to your members of Congress that you support the NVCA position on affiliates for the purpose of these loans, because otherwise we can have small business companies with 10, 15, 20 people with a very modest amount of cash are sometimes being determined to be big businesses because of the affiliation is resulting in the counting of possibly investors and other companies that they've invested in. So, and obviously that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
All right.
John, let me make a comment here. As a bank director, I would say 2 or 3 things to follow up on that. One is you should get in line. These applications for corporations, for companies open on Friday the 3rd, and banks are going to prioritize their workloads. They're also not set up for the volumes that we're talking about. So I would urge you to get in line. Secondly, if you're an LLC, you need to consult with somebody about your own pay, because you're probably not on your payroll system. And that means that you're going to need a tax return to prove your compensation. And here we are in March, April 1st. And if you haven't prepared your 2019 taxes, that may delay the paperwork depending on how the bank thinks about this. So,
Yep.
Yeah, very true.
Thanks. Great input.
All right.
All right. Next slide. I think, the other thing we're talking about with our portfolio companies is be creative. Change creates opportunity. There certainly are some immediate needs that are created because of this crisis. We actually have 4 portfolio companies that are directly trying to respond to COVID-19 with solutions to everything from diagnostics to training for people during the surges. There are business opportunities here, but I think it also this is going to be a tremendous learning experience for society, and I think we can all be confident that there's going to be a dialogue about creating readiness for future pandemics, and I think that will create some business opportunities for many. There are also going to be some significant changes to business models because of this. So reevaluate what you're doing. Are there new ways to reach customers? Are there new ways to communicate? What was unacceptable previously of how you would interact? Right now it's becoming the norm, at least temporarily, and how much of that is going to be sustainable. So I think this is a time to really think about and possibly experiment with different models of how you might sell, service, install, and work with customers, and what are the opportunities you will address. I think it remains to be seen how permanent some of the changes are to the workforce. I personally believe that this is going to be a sustained issue. There are going to be, I think this is not going to be over in a couple months. This is very different than the crises in 2001 and 2008. In both of those circumstances, they had a huge impact on our society, but it seemed that those at risk were a narrow group. In the first group, maybe it was people in larger cities that felt at risk to terrorists. And in 2008, people who had maybe overbought and, got too big a mortgage, or people who had invested in those kinds of securities maybe felt at greater risk. But this is a circumstance where everybody feels at risk, and everybody will be affected in some way or another. So I think it is going to be a sustained change. I think until there is an effective treatment out there, that would certainly make a huge difference, and certainly a vaccine ultimately in the longer run, would put more people a lot more at ease. But I think we are not going to see that any earlier than the fall of 21 or late 21, and that may be even optimistic given the timeline for completing safety trials for something that you're going to give to everybody who's healthy around the globe.
Yeah.
But I would say, when this is all said and done and the book is written about this, entrepreneurs are going to be a key part of that story. I've been amazed at the creativeness within our companies and within other organizations to immediately step up and identify ways to offer solutions to the problems that are facing us all. Mm-hmm. This is a time of opportunity. I guess the one other thing I would say that is a hopeful note from my perspective. Back in it must have been about 2011, 2012. I was down at a conference in Chicago, and Rahm Emanuel was a keynote speaker, and he's very engaging, very entertaining. And but then it got to the Q&A, and one of the questioners said, I'm really worried about the dysfunction in Washington. The two sides are so far apart. Our population is so far apart that we've lost the ability to talk to each other and actually work together to solve our problems. And Rahm Emanuel turned deadly serious and said, look, I was a member of Congress in 2008 when the meltdown was occurring, and most people don't realize how close we had come to our entire financial system melting down at that point in time. And Congress recognized the seriousness of the situation. They stepped up, they did the right thing, they worked together and averted the crisis with swift action. You're seeing that again today. And, if there's anything to be gained from a common enemy, it's to know that, we are one people, and we can work together to solve our problems. So hopefully this will create a renewed source of unity and focus, and help us try to work together better on a going forward basis.
Very good. Well, thank you, John. And I share that that thought. I think we're seeing some of that in what's been going on around legislation affecting young companies. And by the way, we'll try to get a template out to everybody who's on this call that they can use to communicate with their own individual member of Congress. The more voices, the better. Well, let me get right into some of the questions here. And Tim, you touched on this a little bit, but a question from a young entrepreneur who's on the line. If you're an LLC that does not process payroll for employees, so in other words, it's an all equity based company, can you still qualify for these SBA loans?
Probably. The guidance, this morning was that businesses can apply this week, and 1099 based people and solo entrepreneurs can apply on the 10th. So clearly they're going to work up some way to do that, but I would think so. I think that it's going to be, the basis for that may have to be a tax return, which may mean that you may have to get your taxes prepared. I'm not sure if they'll accept a 2018 or 2019, still to be determined. but I would certainly be talking to the banks immediately. And if the bank you're banking at is not an SBA approved lender, you may want to find one. A lot of us, when we started small companies, banked at big banks because it seemed obviously easier, but those are probably the guys that are going to be inundated with large loans in this category and probably won't pay a lot of attention to the small guys. But I think so is the answer.
Okay. John, any further thoughts on that? It sounds like it's at least possible.
Yeah, I would defer to others on that because most of all of our investments are in corporations, so I really haven't studied that issue.
Sure. Another question, and kind of this one to John first, but Tim, I'm sure, has perspectives. Are you noticing a difference in willingness to make new investments between U.S. investors compared to those who might be overseas, Europe or Asia, for example?
I am not. I mean, this is a global issue. Global markets are down overall. We still are, the majority of, we're about half the world's venture capital here in the U.S. I don't see a substantial difference or change based on geography. I think it's an overall systemic change globally.
Okay. A question from another entrepreneur. How would you approach raising capital for a new B2C entity in 2020? Beyond, you've touched on all of those generally, but for a B2C, business to consumer, given that there's likely to be some kind of consumer confidence lag as this crisis passes?
Well, yeah, I think the first question is, is your model still valid? And, how I think anytime you're raising money now, Tim said it, you do have to address why, how things have changed because of this crisis for you. And I think your ability to demonstrate that either your model is unaffected, your customers are unaffected, or that in fact, because of the behavioral change, in B2C, you may even have an argument that it works positively in terms of consumer behavior because people are going to use new channels. So I just think you have to revalidate your model and then just sort of openly discuss how it's changed in this environment and how you've adjusted and and if you've got a case for it improving your prospects, by all means make it.
Mm-hmm. Tim, on that, you mentioned earlier about you're seeing some continued activity around education tech and health tech, and what do you see in this sort of broader category of business?
Well, yeah, I mean, the first thing that I would say is if you've been talking to people, now is a great time to get back and talk to them again. I think we have plenty of seat time these days, and I would go back to the people I've been talking to and talk to them again. If I haven't been doing that, I'd find introductions to people that I can chat with about my ideas, probably at least partially on a getting to know you basis. And then, with business to consumer, we always look at, what's the cost of acquisition? How do we know that? Can we run a quick Facebook test or something? I'm glad to talk more to somebody offline if that's helpful.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Good.
Well, one thing I would add is, the funds that are deploying capital in these kinds of moments in time tend to be some of the best performing funds of a generation.
Absolutely.
Look, now is a time when valuations are modest. everybody's more selective of the deals they get done. So sort of the best of the best get done, and the more marginal deals don't get done. And then what really matters is on making your return, getting your exit is what's the economic climate at the time of exit.
Mm-hmm.
Entering at the top of the market is hard. Paying premium valuations, it makes it really hard to get your multiple. And I think however long this crisis is expected to last, I think most entrepreneurial deals that are the venture community's backing are kind of a 3 to 7 year time frame. And I think even the most pessimistic of prognosticators out there believe that we'll be long past this crisis in that time frame.
A good example, I think, is Sequoia Capital, which about a month ago put out its Black Swan memo about coronavirus being the Black Swan of 2020. But it's also out there raising I think it's about a $5 billion new fund. So that gets to that point. Another question here: does the SBA provide funds for lost fundraising? This is from a research company with minimal revenues, and not sure if they will qualify for underwriting requirements. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, this again, the CARES Act is really focused on payroll. It's basically trying to keep people employed. So, the NewCo that has very little history of employees, unfortunately, there aren't a lot of dollars available under this program for them here.
Yeah. The question that's kind of, it's very timely, given if you've got it. This is from someone who has a term sheet out. So if you had a term sheet in discussion that started in February, what should the founder expect in terms of evaluation haircut?
Well, I mean, it's all open to discussion. We actually have a deal we are going to close on that was in discussion beforehand. It was oversubscribed, and it continues to be oversubscribed, and there's not going to be any change in the valuation. And the company's made the compelling case that, in fact, what they are doing is not going to be disrupted, and what they're doing is providing a revenue source, a continued revenue source for a sector that's otherwise taking a revenue hit, so that there will be a demand for them. So it's really on a deal by deal basis, and I think it's impacted not only by the company but by the nature of the investors. I think I think the funds that are a little bit older, that may be closer to being fully committed, are likely to be the ones that pull in their horns the most, because they're reassessing the reserves for the companies they've already got, and probably beefing those up and deciding to make fewer total investments out of the fund. The newly formed funds, the ones being closed on now, or being announced now, or closed in the last year or two, where a modest amount of the capital has been deployed, aren't going to feel the same kind of pressures, because they're not long down the path of putting their capital to work.
Very good. Tim, let's get your thoughts on that as well, because I know you have talked a lot, forever, as long as I've known you, about relationships between investors and their portfolio companies.
I agree with John. I think that if I'm an entrepreneur and I've got a term sheet and the investor comes back today and says, listen, we'd like to do this, but we've got to lower the valuation to X. I would expect to understand the math. You know, you think we're going to push the result out, or because we were in the, God help us, the retail business, it's going to change things, or what's really the reason? And if the reason is some fairly semi-opaque version of because I think I can, I'd really think about what that long-term relationship's going to feel like.
Yeah.
We're going ahead on a deal. You know, we do a lot of ed tech stuff. We have a couple of healthcare things that are going great guns right now, and we haven't even thought about that. But there are situations where it's perfectly rational. But if I were the entrepreneur, I'd sure want to understand what the logic was. And if it feels the least bit like you're being taken advantage of, I'd ask myself what other alternatives I might have.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Let me ask, I'm going to sneak in one last question here before we begin to wrap this up. How will you, and I think this is a question to both John and Tim, balance the allocation of investment capital to existing or new portfolio companies, as those companies may vary on that continuum of capital they need to get through the slowdown, versus companies that still have business potential? So what's your balancing act as you think about your portfolios in that regard?
Well,
Well,
go
ahead,
ahead.
Tim.
After you.
Well, you know, there's no question. We are reassessing our reserves for all of our portfolio companies. We may make a decision to shrink the number of companies that we do over the life of the fund. And I think that, you know, that's an operating assumption right now, because it's not until we sort of bump up to that number that, you know, we make a decision that we're absolutely done. So, you know, the operating assumption is this is going to go on for a while. Syndications are going to get a little tougher. You know, beef up the balance sheet of the portfolio companies, ride out the storm, and make sure you have ample reserves, because it may be tougher for a while. Now, in the course of you know, over the course of time here, if we get a quicker return to normalcy than many expect, then, you know, we may shift that again. But for right now, we are taking a little bit more care and keeping a little bit more for reserves.
And I would say that we're looking at all of our current investments to see where we can help them get through this and provide the support that they need to do that. And that probably will mean that we'll be a little slower on new investments that we haven't started to explore yet. But we think that if a company is viable, even if they're going to be a year or two longer, that they deserve the support we can bring them. So. I
actually think some of the, you know, the toughest situations are companies that were anticipating an exit event in the coming year. You know, suddenly you have potential acquirers whose market cap is, in some cases, dropped to half or a third of what it was 2 months ago. And they also are feeling like cash is king. And so, you know, companies that thought they were going to be exits and didn't have a need for additional financing are suddenly looking to investors who, you know, didn't think they had to invest anymore in the company and are suddenly in a position where they may have to. So those are some of the real challenging situations and very difficult situations. We had a portfolio company in 2008 where we had a strategic investor who made an investment and got an option to acquire the portfolio company for $100 million. And the expiration date on the option was September 30th, 2008. Well, as we know, on September 29th, in the week before, they were asking for wire transfer instructions. They were, looked like it was going to happen. We were going to make 8x on our money. It was going to be a great outcome. And then on the 29th, Lehman Brothers collapsed, and the acquirer lost over $1 billion of market cap, and they didn't exercise. And we ended up getting an exit, much lower. We had to put more money in to keep it going. We ended up making 2 times our money, which was an okay outcome, but it wasn't 8 times our money, and it was 2 years later. So those are, it's just the realities.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you both. John from Venture Investors, which is Wisconsin's oldest and largest venture fund, and Tim from Golden Angels, which he has been a part of leading that from the inception, and it's one of the largest angel groups in Wisconsin and the Midwest, for that matter. For all of your insights today, for everyone who's online, we'll get back to you with some additional information. We're going to have other events that we'll be scheduling in the future through this format. Before we all have a chance to see each other again live, which I hope is not far away. And thanks again to National, what they've done. I think I hear a log in the background. That's great. That's what we see. So thank you both for joining us, and to everyone, we'll stay safe, and we'll see you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.